Carol held the divorce papers Steve had pushed toward her and quietly read them for several minutes. He sat across from her on the sofa, tapping his fingers impatiently, acting like he couldn't wait for her to sign and disappear from his life. He finally snapped, asking her if she was done reading already. They'd been married 3 years, and even though they had no children, their lives and interests were heavily tied together. She reread the parts stating Steve would pay her a lump sum of $20 million and felt a faint laugh rise in her chest. She picked up the pen, calmly added another zero, and placed the papers back into his hands. She told him that $20 million was too cheap for everything she had done. Her father, Michael, had supported him when the Hayes business was falling apart, and Steve wouldn't even be CEO today if it weren't for her family stepping in. If he wanted freedom, he could pay $200 million. If he agreed, they could walk out right now and end it. For once, Steve didn't immediately have a comeback. Carol knew perfectly well why. He had already cheated on her once in their 2nd year of marriage, and because of Betty, they had fought countless times. Recently, Betty had publicly pretended to be sick during a live stream, dramatically holding her stomach and vomiting for sympathy. And within hours, the whole internet knew she was pregnant. Rumors spread immediately that Steve was involved, and the scandal blew up so fast that even he couldn't deny it. Carol sat there calmly, watching him wrestle between anger and fear. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and told her she was being ridiculous. But she wasn't. She reminded him that she and Michael had carried him through the crisis that nearly destroyed Hayes. And she hinted that Betty didn't have the luxury of time. After all, she was already 3 months pregnant. Did Steve really want his child to be born an illegitimate child? Especially when he, of all people, knew exactly how painful that label could be. His jaw tightened. She had hit the one place she knew he'd crack. After a long silence, he called his lawyer and demanded a revised settlement. Everything else stayed the same except for the payment, which now read $200 million. Carol didn't hesitate. She signed without blinking, and the moment the papers were ready, she and Steve went straight to finalize the divorce. When they walked out of a county building, Betty was already waiting on the steps in a soft white dress, acting gentle and fragile. The moment she saw Steve, she hurried up with a fake stumble, and he rushed to hold her as if she were made of glass. She clung to him, then turned to Carol with a sugary smile and called her Miss Carol, pretending to be polite. Carol didn't bother acknowledging her and made her way down the opposite direction, but Steve stopped her and coldly told her to move out of the mansion as soon as possible. Betty chimed in happily, saying they needed to redecorate and prepare a nursery, gently touching her stomach with intentional sweetness. Carol almost laughed. She was pregnant, too. She just hadn't told anyone yet. And the child certainly wasn't Steve's. She told them she would move out quickly. After her father remarried, Michael, Maria, and her little half-brother Neil had formed their own peaceful little family. Carol didn't want to disturb them after everything, so she planned to move into a house she owned privately. Packing took an entire day, and the moving company spent hours loading her things. Both Michael and Maria tried to convince her to come live with them, but she insisted she needed her own space. It took almost 4 days to settle into her home, and when she finally collapsed on the couch with a bowl of fruit scrolling through her phone, she suddenly received a reminder call from the hospital. She had gone weeks ago for a checkup after feeling unwell, only to discover she was over 8 weeks pregnant. Her first instinct had been panic, and she had scheduled a procedure to end the pregnancy. But now that the day had arrived, she sat frozen on the couch, thinking for a long time. She knew the child wasn't Steve's, and the idea of the baby's father made her head pound. But the longer she stared at the ceiling, the more her heart softened. She realized she didn't want to get rid of the baby. She was divorced, Michael had his own family, and she had no intention of remarrying. Maybe having a child by her side would make her life fuller, not lonelier. The thought blossomed unexpectedly into something warm, something hopeful. She canceled the appointment, changed hospitals, and booked care at a private clinic. After the prenatal checkup, she remembered she still had some books at the mansion, so she stopped by to collect them. She had already arranged for Susan, the housekeeper she trusted most. to resign from the mansion and come work for her instead with a higher salary. When Carol arrived, Susan had already packed the books neatly and handed them to her at the door. Carol didn't expect Steve and Betty to show up at the same moment. Their car pulled up, and Betty jumped out angrily, ignoring Steve's attempts to calm her. Carol kept her expression neutral, confirmed Susan's starting date, and prepared to leave. But Betty intercepted her with exhaustion written all over her face, asking what she was doing there, implying Carol had no business seeing Steve anymore. Carol raised the bag and said she was just getting her things. Steve walked up and frowned suspiciously, asking if she was using this as an excuse to see him. She rolled her eyes and told him she had no interest in ever bothering him again, and wished him and Betty a long life full of children. Steve followed her a few steps and spoke with that familiar cold tone, reminding her how she had always been the one chasing him, giving everything, and that she had never been his type. She looked at him and calmly asked why he married her then. He pressed his lips into a firm line. She knew the answer. Her family's influence had saved his career. Now that he had used her, he had discarded her. There was nothing left to say. Carol left without another glance. Before marrying Steve, she had worked at Michael's company, but she quit after the wedding to start her own design studio specializing in evening wear. After a few days of rest, she returned to work. Michael scolded her at first, saying she acted too quickly. But the moment he heard she had secured $200 million from the divorce, he changed his tune completely, calling Steve a rotten apple unworthy of keeping. Carol thought she might feel sadness, but she didn't. From the moment she decided to let go, Steve barely crossed her mind. Days passed quickly, and then came the final day to pick up the divorce certificate. Steve received a call from the housekeeper at Maplewood and rushed off, leaving Carol sitting in her car staring blankly at the certificate. A sudden tap on the window startled her. She turned and saw Alex, casually smiling as he opened the passenger door and sat down, as if he had every right in the world to be there. He teased her about running away that night after they slept together, and as she instinctively tried to hide her divorce certificate, he took it gently from her hands and slipped it into his pocket with an easy confidence. Then he leaned closer, his eyes dropping to her flat stomach, and asked her why she still hadn't given him a place in her life. After all, she was pregnant with his baby. Alex insisted on driving her to the private clinic for her next appointment, refusing to let her sit in the front seat and making her ride in the back like she was made of porcelain. He kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure she was comfortable, asking if she felt dizzy, if her stomach hurt, if she'd eaten properly that morning. Carol barely had space to answer before he'd ask something else, speaking as if he had been training to become a full-time caretaker his entire life. When they reached the clinic, he hovered over her protectively, his expression tightening every time the nurse touched her wrist or took her blood pressure. Each report they received, he studied it like it was an exam paper searching for hidden dangers and cross-checking everything on his phone. Like he didn't trust the doctor, Carol couldn't help staring at him in disbelief. Growing up, he had always been the quiet type, reserved, polite, never the one to fuss. But now he behaved as if she might collapse if he blinked for too long. After the doctor confirmed everything was normal and reminded her about diet and rest, Alex bombarded her with more questions, almost making the doctor laugh. When they finally walked out of the hospital, Carol just wanted something warm to eat, so she took Alex to a small breakfast spot nearby. The moment they sat down, he cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk seriously. She almost spit out her water when he started calling her Carol, his tone sounding like he was about to propose. He didn't even hide it. He said he'd check the calendar and tomorrow was a good day to get a marriage license. She nearly choked on her food and quickly told him she didn't like younger men. But Alex misunderstood completely, launching into an embarrassed whisper about how she'd said the exact opposite that night they were together. Several customers turned to look at them when he said it out loud, and Carol shoved a bun into his mouth to shut him up. He immediately went quiet, lowering his head like a scolded puppy. When they got back to the car, she told him plainly that she had no intention of marrying him, that the baby was an accident, that she didn't need him to take responsibility for anything. Alex asked her softly if she didn't like him at all, and she had to force herself to stay firm. She told him she had slept with him that night only out of anger towards Steve, and if it hadn't been him, it could have been someone else. Alex didn't argue. He just drove her home silent the entire way. Ever since she became pregnant, her cravings changed constantly. Some days she loved Susan's cooking, and other days every smell annoyed her. Lately, Susan's cooking suddenly became good again, too good. Carol didn't think much until she realized Susan had been constantly texting someone, always hiding her phone. She assumed it was a boyfriend, until she caught a glimpse of the screen and realized it was Alex. Every recipe Susan had used these last 2 days, every ingredient, seasoning, even the delivery of fresh produce had all come from Alex. The vegetables, the meat, the seafood. Everything was delivered in iced boxes with handwritten notes telling her what was safe for pregnancy. Carol wanted to be annoyed, but each meal tasted so good she couldn't even complain. By the time she hit 3 months, she gained a little weight and her face looked healthier. Susan laughed and said she looked completely different from when she lived at Maplewood. Those last months of her marriage had drained her emotionally, and that huge, cold mansion nearly suffocated her every day. Now she lived however she wanted, eating good food, sitting on her balcony sketching designs, sleeping whenever she felt like it. Life was simple and peaceful, something she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Michael called about a banquet. He couldn't attend because Neil had a fever and Maria was at the hospital with them. He needed Carol to go in his place. The invitation arrived later that evening. She got ready with a loose dress and flats. Her belly wasn't big, but the restriction of heels made her nervous. When she arrived at the banquet hall, the last person she expected to see waiting at the entrance was Alex. He walked up immediately, slipped his arm through hers, and asked if she minded him being her escort. Before she could answer, he leaned slightly and whispered that Steve and Betty were inside too. She nodded and walked in with him. People had talked a lot about Steve and Betty since the divorce. They attended events together now, but Betty's attempts to copy Carol's style were an ongoing joke among the wealthy wives. She had neither the background nor the manners to blend in, yet she tried desperately to act like she belonged. When Carol entered, one of the ladies she knew well, Sylvia, came over warmly and greeted her. Carol chatted politely while Alex was pulled aside by an older acquaintance for a few minutes. Soon more women gathered around Carol, happy to see her, and she could practically feel Betty's frustration across the room. Betty, heavily pregnant now, clung to Steve's arm like he might disappear if she let go. She forced a smile while the women politely ignored her. Eventually, she approached Carol with her breathy, sugary tone and asked why she was sitting alone. Carol lifted her eyes slowly, the cupcake on her plate suddenly unappealing, and replied coldly that she was sitting alone because she wasn't an animal like the two of them crowding her table. Steve immediately scolded her, pretending she was the unreasonable one. He said Betty only cared about her, that they didn't have to be enemies. Carol nearly laughed. She reminded Betty how she had sent intimate photos of her and Steve to brag just months earlier. The way Betty froze mid-blank was almost satisfying. Before the tension grew worse, Alex returned, placing a gentle hand on Carol's shoulder. His voice carried a soft mockery as he addressed Betty's name like it was some sort of joke. Then he told Carol he had chicken noodle soup waiting for her and led her away without letting her look back. Steve called her name sharply, questioning her about Alex, but Carol turned and told him to guess. Walking off with Alex Stott after that night, Steve kept trying to contact her, but she ignored every call and message. Weeks later, when Carol was around, 3.5 months pregnant, she felt sudden discomfort in her stomach one night. Susan panicked and immediately called Alex. By the time he reached the house, the pain had mostly passed, but he refused to take chances and rushed her to the hospital. He stayed awake the entire night, pacing anxiously, checking on her every few minutes. The doctor said the pain had probably come from overeating. She had eaten too many potato pancakes at dinner. Alex didn't even crack a smile. When the doctor finally left them alone, Alex sat at the edge of her bed, leaned in close, and quietly asked if he could move in with her. She pretended not to hear him. He moved closer, lowering his forehead to touch hers, his breath warm against her cheek as he whispered for a chance, just a chance. The kiss he gave her was almost too soft to feel. When he pulled back and asked if she hated it, she could only shake her head before pushing him lightly and telling him to get off, because he was pressing on her stomach. The doctor kept her overnight to be safe, and on the day she was discharged, she ran straight into Steve and Betty in the hallway. Betty looked tired and anxious, clinging to him. Carol wore a fitted shirt that didn't hide her small bump anymore. When Steve's eyes fell to her stomach, his expression darkened with a rage she had never seen. He rushed toward her, shouting, demanding to know who the father was. She didn't even have to answer because Alex stepped between them and shoved Steve away, calling him a mad dog. Betty grabbed Steve's arm to calm him, but he shook her off. Alex held Carol close and told her not to mind the crazy man. They walked outside, but Steve wasn't done. He blocked their path at the entrance, teeth clenched, demanding to talk. Carol smirked and reminded him he once told her to go find a man too. And now he was angry she did exactly that. Steve's face turned pale, his jaw tightening so hard it looked painful. She left with Alex without looking back. Steve tried finding her again later, waiting outside her building. She refused to go downstairs for days. Alex offered to walk with her for fresh air, and they finally went out one evening when they were sure Steve had left. Only then did Carol learn Steve had rushed out of town for a work disaster at Hayes. She gave Alex a suspicious look, and he didn't even bother lying. He calmly said it was his doing. He promised her Steve wouldn't bother her again. Then he turned his phone to show her a pink crib design and asked her if she wanted it custom made for baby John. She stared at the pink, bumper covered in little cartoon letters, and asked what they would do if the baby was a boy. Alex only laughed and said boys could still use pink because babies didn't know the difference. When she was 4 months pregnant, Alex had a work emergency and couldn't accompany her to her checkup. Susan went with her instead, and while waiting for her turn, Carol sat near the elevators right when Steve unexpectedly showed up. He had 2 bodyguards with him and looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot. Before she could react, she instinctively called Alex, but Steve grabbed the phone and hung up the call. His voice was low, almost calm, as he told her she and Alex were impossible. He said Alex's family would never accept her and her unborn child would be nothing but a burden. He told her to get rid of the baby and he would remarry her as if he was offering her some great mercy. Carol almost burst out laughing. She stood up and tried to walk past him, but he grabbed her, covering her mouth before she could scream. His bodyguard? Steve dragged Carol toward the stairwell, his grip tight enough to bruise, his voice trembling with a twisted mix of panic and obsession. He kept saying they were even now, that since he had cheated and she had cheated, they could start over as if nothing had happened. His breath was shaky, his eyes bloodshot, and he looked nothing like the composed CEO he pretended to be in public. Carol pushed against him, but he only tightened his hold, trying to force her down the stairs toward the underground parking garage. For a moment, she felt pure terror shoot through her chest. Steve wasn't thinking straight. He didn't care that she was pregnant. He didn't care if she fell. All he cared about was control. She tried to kick him, but he clamped his hand harder over her mouth, warning her that if she struggled, she might hurt herself. Every word confirmed just how unhinged he had become. When they reached the stairwell door, he pushed it open with his shoulder, dragging her inside as his bodyguards followed silently behind them. Carol felt her heart pounding so fast it hurt. She thought of little John inside her belly, and panic twisted through her until she felt lightheaded. But before she could think of another attempt to scream, Steve kept talking, ranting, apologizing, begging, contradicting himself again and again. He said he didn't know when he fell in love with her. He said she scared him because she came from a better family. He said hurting her was the only way he could prove himself. Carol felt sick listening to him. Not because she cared about his words, but because it was terrifying to realize he truly believed them. She stayed quiet, letting him ramble, waiting for even the smallest chance to break free. And then the chance came. Steve's car pulled onto a narrow road after he shoved her into the passenger seat. Before he could lock the door, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of them, blocking the entire road. The door flew open and Alex jumped out, face flushed with fury, looking like he was 2 seconds away from murder. Steve tried to slam the door, but Carol shoved it open with all her strength just as Alex grabbed Steve by the collar and punched him hard across the jaw. Steve stumbled, but immediately swung back. Within seconds, both men were throwing punches, slamming each other against the car, fueled by rage. Steve's bodyguards moved forward as if ready to help, but Steve shouted at them not to intervene, his pride forcing him to fight alone. Carol hurried to the back seat, grabbed her phone, turned it on, and dialed the emergency number with trembling fingers. She didn't stop shaking even after she heard the operator's voice. Police arrived minutes later and separated the men, before either could seriously injure the other. At the station, the officers initially treated it like a simple fight. They made Steve and Alex fill out forms, prepared to give them both a warning. Carol could see how angry Alex still was, breathing hard, knuckles scraped and red. But she stood before anyone signed anything and spoke clearly so the whole room could hear her. She told the officers Steve had kidnapped her. She told them he tried to force her to abort her child. She told them she was pregnant and that he was not the father. Steve's face turned gray, his jaw tightening as he tried to shout over her. But Alex stepped between them and told him to shut up. Alex turned to the officers and insisted they check the hospital cameras and investigate the stairwell. He grabbed the closest officer by the sleeve and demanded they treat Steve like the criminal he was. Steve went silent, not because he agreed, but because he had no defense. The police detained him temporarily and sent officers to verify her story. It was already late afternoon by the time Carol finally made it home. Alex drove slowly, still furious, but trying not to show it. Susan had cooked her favorite dishes and kept hovering nervously, asking if she was okay, offering her warm water and blankets, and fussing like a worried mother. Only after Carol had eaten a little did Alex finally sit beside her, his expression tight with guilt. He blamed himself for not being there. Even though Carol tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, that night she let him stay. She was too shaken to push him away, too exhausted to pretend she didn't need the comfort. After she showered and read for a bit, she finally drifted into sleep, only to fall straight into nightmares. She dreamed of Steve tying her down, dreamed of losing little John, dreamed of screaming with no sound coming out. She woke drenched in sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Before she could even sit up, Alex burst into the room, his voice full of panic. As he knelt beside her, without asking, he pulled her into his arms, his warmth grounding her as her breathing steadied. He apologized again and again, stroking her back until her trembling stopped. Carol whispered that she feared Steve wouldn't face consequences. She was right, the security footage was gone by the time police checked. He walked free with nothing but a warning. But Alex promised her he wouldn't let Steve get near her again. In the following days, Carol stayed home on bed rest. Noah's company, Hayes, began collapsing from the pressure Michael and Alex were quietly putting on it. Projects were lost. One after another, chaos spreading inside the company. But instead of sympathy for her ex-husband, Carol found herself strangely calm, almost detached. Steve's downfall had nothing to do with her anymore. She had a new life forming inside her and Alex by her side. Even if she didn't fully understand what that meant yet, she only wanted peace, but peace didn't last long. One afternoon, scandal exploded online, an accusation that Carol had cheated with Alex during her marriage. The posts included times, locations, and even photos of the hotel where they'd stayed that night. It went viral within minutes. People mocked her, judged her, dragged her name through every corner of the internet. But just as the comments reached their ugliest point, Another scandal hit even harder. Someone exposed Betty and Steve's entire history, her background, her family, her past relationships, and the truth behind her pregnancy. Carol thought it was Alex at first, but when he came home, he told her it wasn't him, it was Maria Daw, and that was when everything truly began to change. Carol didn't expect Maria to get involved, but once the truth about Betty spread online, she understood why. Maria had always been quiet and refined, but the moment she realized someone had tried to ruin Carol's reputation with fake accusations, she stepped in without hesitation. Everything about Betty's past went public: her mother's scandal, her financial problems, even the truth behind her pure image. And suddenly, the comments that once mocked Carol turned into praise, calling her graceful, calling her patient, calling her the real victim of both Steve and Betty. That shift didn't feel triumphant to Carol. She just felt tired. She hadn't wanted any revenge. She only wanted to live quietly, raise her baby, and rebuild her life. But the peace she tried to keep didn't last. One evening, she received a call from Jessica. Her voice was gentle and warm, but there was an urgency behind it. She told Carol she wanted both families to sit down together for dinner. Carol didn't want unnecessary tension, and Jessica had watched her grow up, so she reluctantly agreed, even though a strange uneasiness spread across her chest. The dinner happened on Saturday evening in a private room. The atmosphere was surprisingly calm. Michael and Maria greeted Jessica politely, and Sylvia even complimented Carol on how radiant she looked lately. It felt almost too perfect. Then Alex's aunt made a careless comment about Carol being divorced. Maria looked up and shut her down immediately, defending Carol with a sharpness she rarely showed publicly. Jessica tried to smooth things over, insisting she didn't care how many times Carol had been married. Alex reached for Carol's hand across the table and spoke softly, telling her he wanted to take care of her for the rest of his life. Carol felt her heart tremble at his sincerity, but before she could react, Maria scoffed that words meant nothing. Alex didn't argue. Instead, he placed a folder on the table, slid it toward Carol, and told everyone that the papers inside were all his assets, every last thing he owned. If Carol wanted him, it was hers. If she didn't, she could still pay him a monthly salary. Like an employee. Michael nearly dropped his chopsticks. Jessica froze. And even Maria went silent as the weight of his sincerity filled the entire room. Carol didn't give an answer right away. She wasn't ready, and Alex didn't pressure her. A few days later, curiosity got the better of her, and she finally asked him what he actually liked about her. She expected him to tease or avoid the question, but instead his ears turned red. He told her everything: how she defended him when he was bullied as a child, how she tutored him patiently, and how a dream about her in high school had terrified him so much he couldn't even look her in the eye for days. He confessed that even when she married Steve, he still thought of her, still wanted to steal her away, still imagined what it would be like to have her beside him. Hearing all of that made Carol's chest ache. She had never expected that the quiet boy she once protected had loved her for so long. She didn't answer him immediately, but she began considering his sincerity more seriously. When she was 5 months pregnant, a spontaneous moment made her choose. They were on their way to lunch when they passed the county building. A newlywed couple walked out, smiling brightly, hands entwined, and without thinking, Carol asked Alex if he wanted to get married. The joy on his face was instantaneous, almost childlike. They didn't even bother going to the restaurant. They walked straight inside and got their marriage certificate. Just like that, Dot, as her pregnancy progressed, visiting the hospital became routine. Friends came to visit her and gossip about everything happening with Steve and Betty. That was how Carol found out Betty's baby wasn't Steve's at all. Betty had found a random donor to secure her place in Steve's life and then got blackmailed by the father. When Steve learned the truth, he had dragged Betty to the hospital and forced a DNA test. When the results came back, he kicked her out of Maplewood without a second thought. Betty tried to see him again, but he refused. She ended up giving birth alone to a baby girl and abandoning her at the hospital. Steve denied everything and refused to take responsibility. His personal reputation collapsed, his business fell apart, and the Hayes family elders backed another relative instead of him. He lost clients, projects, and support in every direction. Carol felt nothing when she heard it. Not pity, not satisfaction, just nothing. He no longer had any connection to her life. She had Alex now, and soon she would have John, a few days before the new year. After a long day of contractions, she finally gave birth naturally to a healthy baby boy. When she woke up, Alex was sitting beside the bed, tearful and tender, asking if she wanted water or if the incision hurt. She looked at her son in his tiny crib, then at Alex hovering beside her like an anxious puppy in love, and for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Alex kissed her cheek and thanked her for being willing to build a family with him, calling her honey in the softest voice. After her recovery, Alex began preparing their wedding exactly as he had promised. The ceremony took place by the sea, surrounded only by close family and friends. Carol stood in her white gown while Alex knelt to fix the hem for her, smiling up at her like she was the only person in his world. That night, after everything ended, she remembered the love letters he once said he wrote. She teased him about them, and after blushing bright red, he read them to her in his smooth, shy voice. The next morning, she found him on the living room floor helping baby John practice rolling over. Sunlight streamed through the balcony as father and son played together. Their matching eyes bright with joy. Carol stood in the doorway watching them, realizing with a warm swell in her chest that her life had finally become something gentle and beautiful. Everything painful was behind her now. She had her son. She had Alex. She had peace. Carol thought the hardest parts of her story were finally behind her, but becoming a new mother came with its own world of emotions. She had imagined sleepless nights, endless diapers, and messy feedings, but what she didn't expect was how deeply she would fall in love with John the moment she held him. He had Alex's charming eyes and her nose, tiny fingers curling around her thumb like he already knew she'd protect him forever. Alex was even worse. He hovered. He panicked. He overreacted to every sneeze John made. He memorized the feeding schedule better than any doctor. He wasn't just trying to be involved, he was terrified of doing anything wrong. Sometimes Carol caught him sitting quietly beside the crib, just watching their son breathe as if it was the most precious miracle in the world. During her recovery, Carol barely had time to think about anything else. She spent her days between feeding John, napping, sketching designs for new gowns, and watching Alex fuss around like an overgrown, lovesick puppy with no idea what to do with his hands unless they were touching her or the baby. But she liked the routine, the warmth, the calmness. It felt like life had finally settled into something soft and safe. Alex took over all the wedding preparations because he refused to let her stress. He double-checked every detail from the flowers to the menu to the music playlist. Carol didn't even realize how much he had done until the night before the ceremony, when she saw everything perfectly arranged and realized he had planned it with the kind of care most men didn't even give to planning their own birthdays. On the wedding day, the sky was crystal clear and the sea breeze was cool enough to feel refreshing but not cold. The ceremony was small Michael and Maria on one side, Jessica and Alex's family on the other, Sylvia and a few close friends smiling from the seats. Carol walked across the aisle slowly, her gown brushing the soft grass, and Alex looked at her like he was witnessing something holy. When he held her hands and whispered his vows, she felt every word sink into her heart. After the reception, when everything was finally quiet, Carol found herself lying in Alex's arms, listening to him breathe softly against her ear. His warmth, his voice, the way he stroked her hair, it all blended together until she felt like nothing existed outside. That moment, she asked him about the love letters he once mentioned, expecting him to avoid the topic. Instead, he blushed so hard she couldn't stop laughing. He eventually pulled out a small box filled with envelopes, each one dated and sealed. Instead of giving them to her to read, he opened one and read it aloud. His voice was low and sincere, describing the day he realized he couldn't look at her without wanting to protect her, love her, and be close to her. She had never heard such earnest devotion directed at her before. She drifted to sleep that night with his voice still echoing softly in her mind. The next morning, she woke to the sound of Alex laughing quietly in the living room. When she peeked from the bedroom doorway, she saw him lying on the floor while little John kicked his legs excitedly in front of him. Alex clapped and cheered at every tiny movement, acting like John had just won an Olympic medal. Sunlight spilled through the open balcony door, warming the room and making the scene look like something out of a painting. For a long moment, Carol just watched them, father and son, both smiling, both safe, both hers. Everything she had endured, the heartbreak, the humiliation, the betrayal, the loneliness felt like a distant memory compared to the peace she had now. Steve and Betty were nothing more than shadows in her past. She had no anger left for them, only indifference. Their choices and their downfall were theirs to carry. She was finally free. Carol walked over and knelt beside her boys. Alex looked up at her with that hopelessly loving smile, the same one he always had when she walked into a room. John gurgled and reached for her. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, she realized that life had finally given her something that couldn't be. Taken away a gentle future, a family of her own, and a love that had waited patiently for years.